Well, in the last video we talked about the historical context of 1966 and some of the things that were going on. And I mentioned along the way that the Beatles had pretty much finished the Revolver album by the time they started that crazy summer tour of 1966 that brought an end to their live touring. And I also mentioned there were two bands. There was the studio band and the live band. And so now we're going to talk about the album Revolver and really see what it was that they had already finished before they went out to greet all these screaming fans and threats and all the craziness that went with that. The album was recorded in April through June of 1966 and released in August of 1966, quickly going to #1 on both sides of the Atlantic. You might be interested to know that the cover drawing on Revolver is done by Klaus Voormann, who was one of the young people the Beatles used to hang out with during their Hamburg days, and so they kept a connection with Klaus Voormann. Klaus actually was part of a Brian Epstein pop group that really didn't have a lot of success, at least not in this country so much. And then Klaus would later play bass on various Beatle solo projects and things. So a guy who was pretty close to the group, a good buddy. Anyway, it's his drawing on the front of the Revolver cover. Like Rubber Soul, Revolver continues to move toward the artist model, as I said in the last video. Serious lyrics, the use of new instruments and electronic music techniques drawn from avant-garde, backward tape masking, all kinds of things going on that are really pushing the musical level, or the musical ambition of the group forward. But it's also important to note that they continue to be influenced by American pop and continue to be interested in doing pop music. It's not like they're going completely artistic here. There's certainly elements of pop involved. So let's have a look at some of the songs on Revolver. Starting with the John songs. The first John song we get is I'm Only Sleeping. This is a song that many commentators have said is a pretty good expression of a kind of drug lethargy. You may remember that in last week I mentioned that John Lennon had characterized Rubber Soul as the pot album and Revolver as the acid album. So maybe there's some sense of kind of drug lethargy that he was trying to portray, who knows. But anyway, I'm Only Sleeping as an AABA form. It's got the verses have got little refrains that are chorus-like. So it's almost like a little blend between a contrasting verse-chorus and an AABA. But again, AABA predominantly here, and that really kind of shows that form is really not gone at all. An interesting song with backward guitar, and again, we're sort of talking about this use of backward tape effect as a way of creating kind of far out, kind of heading towards psychedelic kind of things here, using the studio, something that could never have been done live. She Said, another John Lennon song with lyrics inspired by Peter Fonda remark about death and LSD. It's the easy part to talk about here is this is another AABA form. So again, like I said, amidst all of these sort of artistic ambitions, the AABA form was not entirely abandoned, even though there are plenty of other forms involved in this music. Why I'm chuckling is that the story behind this seems to be that John Lennon was at a party in California at which Peter Fonda, who was then kind of a young Turk in the films, Easy Rider, that kind of thing, Peter Fonda was at this, and they were tripping on LSD, and Peter Fonda was telling had some kind of an accident where he'd actually been dead in the emergency room, and they revived him. And so he kept telling John Lennon, I know what it's like to be dead. I know what it's like to be dead. And it totally freaked Lennon out, one of these kinds of things where it's, stop, you're freaking me out, man. So anyway, John uses that experience for She Said, and he transforms it from, it's kind of a meditation on death, but it's really a meditation on a relationship, male-female relationship. But again, inspired by this LSD experience. This goes back to something I was saying before about the Beatles being inspired, and the creative spark being there from things that they'd done when they were using drugs, but it wasn't like when they went into the studio, they were tripping when they were, I mean, they were professional enough to know you really couldn't get the best result doing that way. So it may be a song about LSD, but it's not a song on LSD. Another John song, And Your Bird Can Sing. One of the great things about this tune is the use of the harmony guitars here, something that would become very popular in the 70s between dual lead guitar players. But here we've got John Lennon and George Harrison. I think Paul's even involved in there too, playing harmony guitars all throughout this one. Some great harmony guitar lines there. This is a kind of a broken AABA form, so again, we're not getting too far afield formally from things that we've seen before. The song Dr. Robert is mostly a John song. The song, I think, is probably not about any particular person. Dr. Robert does not directly refer to only one person, but an amalgam of different people. But the person who it's most often associated is a New York doctor by the name of Robert Freeman, who was one of these kinds of doctors that would give people these vitamin shots to sort of help them feel better, but of course inside the vitamin shot would be a lot of amphetamines too, and so they would immediately feel, hey, I've got a lot more energy. Of course you do, I just shot you full of amphetamines. And it was known to have tons and tons of celebrity clients come through his office, including Jackie Kennedy or Jackie Onassis. So anyway, the idea of a doctor feel-good who would give people, who had the money to afford it, these sort of shots. That's sort of what the song is about. Again, an AABA form, so amidst all this artist stuff, we've got yet another AABA form. The last John song we'll talk about on Revolver is Tomorrow Never Knows. That's one that I'm going to spend a lot more time talking about in our close-up. But the interesting thing about this tune is that it was one of the first sessions Tomorrow Never Knows was recorded, or at least they started working on it. So it's fairly early in the process. It's a song that's at the very end of the album and is usually thought of as the song that really indicates the Beatles' first move towards psychedelia. It uses tape loops and chance elements. It uses what I'm going to call found lyrics, in this case from the Timothy Leary book called The Psychedelic Experience. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the close-up. It's a simple verse form, and it is probably the most progressive and ambitious piece so far from John Lennon, and as I say, ends the album. Turning to the Paul songs, the first song we can turn our attention to is Eleanor Rigby, which is probably the most ambitious Paul McCartney song to date. It uses strings related to, we can relate it to Yesterday and Michelle. We'll talk a little bit more about the lyric structure. That one will also be featured in the next video where I do a musical close-up. Some other Paul songs, Here, There, and Everywhere, which is reportedly inspired by the Beach Boys song God Only Knows. Maybe so, I don't know. It's an AABA form at any rate. Yellow Submarine was Paul's attempt to write, mostly Paul, his attempt to write a children's song. Some people could see drug references in it, but if you're into those kinds of double entendres, you can find drug references in almost anything, I suppose. Anyway, Paul has said that it's about that moment when you're lying in bed just before you fall asleep and you're sort of still semi-conscious and all kinds of amazing things can happen in your imagination. And Yellow Submarine is sort of about that state. Good Day Sunshine is reportedly inspired by the Love and Spoonful, a contrasting verse-chorus song, as is Yellow Submarine, and we just finished talking about. For No One is a fascinating tune that we'll get into in the close-up in the next video. But this is a great one as far as relationship lyrics go, and something which I will suggest is a kind of potential looping of the song that relates to lyrical content. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. The last big Paul song on the record, Got to Get You Into My Life, again influenced by Memphis soul, the sort of Stax sound, the use of horns. This one a contrasting verse-chorus, a kind of tune. There was actually a plan at some point to try to get the Beatles to record in the Stax studio. They were so, at least Paul was very sort of enamored of the Memphis sound, but it turned out the logistics of actually getting them into that studio so that they could work and all that kind of thing were just impossible. So they did their best to get a Stax sound right there in the Abbey Road studios in London. 3 George songs on Revolver. Taxman, which we will take some time on during the close-up in the next video. Angry lyrics and some witticisms that I will connect up with the techniques of Lieber and Stoller and those Coasters records, of which the Beatles did many covers of Coasters records earlier on. But we'll save that discussion for the next video. Love You Too. I won't get a chance to talk about this one in detail, but this is one that we will keep referring to because it's the first big George song to do the Eastern sitar kind of thing as a George song. Now, of course, on Rubber Soul, we can talk about Norwegian Wood and the first real use of the sitar, but now we're going to start to get a sequence of George songs that really are almost like Indian raga kinds of things, and so Love You Too is the first one of those. So put a little check mark by that, because we're going to come back to that this week as we talk about some of the music that comes forward. Again, a simple verse form on that one. I Want to Tell You, another George song, a great little pop song in AABA form. So as we look over the music on Revolver as in a kind of a general way, here are some of the musical features that really strike us. The lyrics become increasingly serious, philosophical, sometimes drug-related, plus there is an avant-garde kind of thing, and we'll talk about that especially with regard to Tomorrow Never Knows. We've seen this happening all the way. In many ways, George Harrison has said Revolver is kind of Rubber Soul Volume 2, so we're seeing a pretty regular and marked progression in this regard. The forms are diverse, but as much as in the close-up I'm going to emphasize some of the interesting things they do with form, we have to remember that I've listed a lot of AABA songs here as we've gone through, so it's not like they've given that up entirely. Remember how important that was on those first couple of records, and now things are really much more diverse, formally speaking. Instrumentation begins to continues to employ classical references, so we get strings, for example, in Eleanor Rigby, French horn in For No. We're getting tape effects. We've talked about the tape effects, and we'll talk about that more when we get into Tomorrow Never Knows and some of the others. And the use of horns. We haven't really had a real sort of Beatles sort of horns tune like we've had with Got to Get You Into My Life on this album. The style for this album starts to become increasingly varied. Sgt. Pepper will be kind of one of the high watermarks for variety of styles on an album. But just think of the contrast between something like Here, There, and Everywhere and Tomorrow Never Knows. Very different kinds of very different kinds of tracks. So we're starting to see a much broader range. So in the next video, let's take a closer look at a couple of songs from Revolver here. Let's look at 2 John songs, Rain and Tomorrow Never Knows, 2 Paul songs, Eleanor Rigby and For No One, and the George song, Taxman.